Well, first of all, I want to thank you for choosing to attend a presentation with the word spiritual in the title. I'm assuming either that you have some interest in the topic and its relationship to patient care, or you have no idea what room that you just walked into and you're looking for a way to slip out. I trust that it is the former. If it happens to be the latter, I encourage you to stick around. Whatever our background may be, I think we're all a lot more spiritually inclined than we may think or perhaps let on. And I think it's this spirituality, this sense of connectedness to something larger than ourselves that can be inspired either by a walk in the woods, a great baseball game, or for some folks, including myself, a particular religious practice. I also believe that it's this quality of thought that we cultivate within ourselves and help support in other people that can make a big difference in what we broadly define as the healing process. So to illustrate my point, I want to share a story with you. It's a story that includes both drama and humor and even a happy ending. Sorry for giving away the ending. It also happens to be a true story. I just turned 15, and a friend and I were on a hike in the San Jacinto Mountains near Palm Springs, specifically Taquit's Peak, for those of you who may be familiar with that area. On our way back down the mountain, I lost my footing on a patch of ice and ended up sliding about 1,000 feet down a snow and rock-covered chute. By the time that I came to a stop, my body had obviously taken quite a beating. My pelvis was shattered. My leg had been broken in two. My hand was broken. My face was pretty banged up. And as I would later find out, there was also some internal bleeding. Now, the good news was that nothing had happened to my teeth. Actually, I would call this great news because just a year before this, I had gotten my braces off, and I knew my parents would be really upset that they'd learned that their investment had been completely blown. Now, the other bit of good news was the apple I found in my day pack, an apple that by some miracle had absolutely no bruises on it. I don't like eating bruised apples. So there I was, wedged against this small shrub on the side of an icy slope, obviously in a lot of pain, eating my apple and praying my heart out for the next 3 or 4 hours while my friend ran down the mountain and got some help. Now, this was late afternoon in mid-February, so it was getting pretty cold. Fortunately, just before sunset, a rescue team arrived by helicopter and flew me, by this point unconscious, flew me to a nearby hospital. Now, this was the first time that I had ever been admitted to any kind of a medical facility. Not because my parents or I had any aversion to doctors, but because there simply had never been any need. Now, the reason I mention this is because I was raised as a Christian Scientist. And there's often the assumption that either the church prohibits its members from ever going to a doctor, or at least encourages us not to do so, or that by receiving any kind of medical treatment, we're somehow putting our salvation in jeopardy. Well, suffice it to say, neither of these assumptions is true. Now, the vast majority of Christian Scientists that I know tend to rely with success on an exclusively prayer-based approach to healthcare, but that doesn't mean that they're compelled to do so, or that there haven't been times when they found themselves in a medical facility. Well, that said, I have a number of close friends, some who are in their 80s and 90s, who aside from maybe giving birth, have never been to a medical facility and have never taken medication of any kind. Again, not because of an aversion to medicine, but because they found their prayer practice to be effective. So getting back to the hospital, the first thing that I remember when I regained consciousness was hearing a nurse ask my mom if I was allergic to any foods. Now, with my eyes still closed, it occurred to me to say, asparagus, thinking that if I did, that would reduce my chances of being served what was then a dreaded vegetable. So the nurse repeated that, asparagus, and she dutifully wrote it down on my admission form. And then with a chuckle, and what I'm sure was a great sense of relief to see me alert and awake, my mom says to the nurse, "He's not allergic to anything. He just doesn't like asparagus. Obviously, nothing's happened to his sense of humor." Now, that is what I would call a spiritually competent parent. That is, someone who is capable of looking past what I'm sure was a pretty alarming picture and seeing a part of me that had not been beaten, bruised, or broken. In fact, I would say that it's what Mom discerned in that brief moment of levity that helped me, and maybe even helped the nurse, to see the very same thing. And in so doing, to help alleviate whatever sense of fear might have been swirling around the room at that time. Now, the reason for my including this part of the story is to illustrate that in practice, there's really no difference between a spiritually competent parent and a spiritually competent doctor or nurse. At its root, spiritual competency is basically a willingness to take into account something other than mere physical appearances. Some might describe this as treating the whole patient. I see it as treating the patient as inherently whole, defined not by their body, but by their divinely bestowed and divinely maintained qualities, including a sense of humor. Now, last year at this same conference, I moderated a panel discussion on this same subject of teaching spiritual competencies to medical students. So I'm keenly aware of the resistance to addressing something other than a patient's physical needs. Based on the comments that I heard from the physicians that I met, there's basically three main objections that I heard. Number one, that's not part of my job description. Number two, even if it were, I don't have time to do it. And the third objection is that even if I had the time, what good would it do? Now, since I'm speaking today strictly from a patient's perspective, I'm going to focus mostly on that last objection. But before I do, let me touch just briefly on the first two. Now, I get it that doctors shouldn't be expected to be experts in all things spiritual and religious. Generally speaking, that's chaplain's work. But given the fact that there are a whole lot more doctors than there are chaplains in our hospitals, and a lot more patients than you might think who are wanting to engage on this level, as many as 77% according to one survey that I read, it would appear to be in everyone's best interest to at least know the basics. Now, speaking of the basics, there's a doctor I heard speak at a previous conference, another conference, who said that the most basic question that he likes to ask each one of his patients is simply this: what do I need to know about you as a person to give you the best care possible? It's a question that not only opens up the lines of communication, maybe revealing something helpful about the character and the background of that individual, but it's also something that can help both patient and doctor alike dial into their innate spirituality, their sense of meaning and purpose, and maybe even their connection to a higher power. Now, as for not having enough time for this sort of thing, I've spoken to more than a few doctors who have said that even brief interactions along these lines can actually save both time and money. Now, this brings us to that third objection I mentioned. Assuming they have the time, what difference does it make having a spiritually competent doctor? For me, it made a huge difference. Although I was in a hospital, mainly because my legs were both in traction, the staff gave me plenty of leeway in terms of my decidedly non-medical, prayer-based approach to caring for myself. Now, this meant, for instance, that after some initial surgery, I was not given, nor did I require, any pain medication. And by the way, when I say prayer, I'm not talking about a kind of wishful thinking that some might associate with this word, but rather an ongoing and deeply profound awareness of and communion with that universal and holy benevolent principle that I call God. An awareness that for me is the key to healing. Mary Baker Eddy, who founded Christian Science, writes, "The prayer that heals the sick is an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of Him, of this divine principle, an unselfed love. Even if from the outside it doesn't look like much is going on, that doesn't mean that this kind of prayer isn't having a real and measurable impact on the individual involved." And I found this to be true one afternoon when one of my doctors recommended that I have immediate surgery to repair my pelvis. Apparently the bones weren't knitting together as well as he had hoped, and the plan was to insert a plate. My parents and I asked if, instead of going ahead with the immediate surgery, we might take the rest of the afternoon and evening to pray about the situation. My doctor agreed and said he would still plan on coming by the next morning to prep for an operation. Now, on the surface, that might look like a fairly mundane communication between patient and doctor. But what was left unsaid was just as important as what was said. See, during the previous 3 weeks, the hospital staff taking care of me had observed not only a pretty rapid recovery from what were considered life-altering, if not life-threatening injuries, but also a patient and a patient's family relying wholeheartedly on prayer for healing, and with good results. On one occasion, during an operation shortly after my arrival at the hospital to stop the internal bleeding, the doctors ended up finding nothing wrong. As one of the people on the surgical team put it, someone must have gotten in there before us. And within a relatively short time, every scratch and scar on my face had healed over without any medical intervention. So what my doctor didn't say when my parents and I asked for time before going ahead with the recommended surgery, but what we definitely sensed from him was that he trusted us to make the right decision in terms of my physical health. Well, the next morning, new x-rays were taken, which showed dramatic improvement. Instead of carting me off to the operating room, plans were made for me to complete my recovery at home. In fact, I ended up leaving the hospital the next day. Within 4 months, I was up and out of my wheelchair and leading my high school marching band in a parade. And since then, I've been able to walk across the Grand Canyon in a single stretch and ride my bike for as many as 200 miles in a single stretch. Now, I don't recall this doctor, or anybody else in the hospital staff for that matter, ever asking me if there was anything they needed to know about me as a person in order to take the best care of me possible. I think for them it was more intuition. The important thing is that they both respected and were responsive to my spiritual needs. And what was the effect? In my case, a sooner than expected discharge from the hospital. Zero concern about prescribing potentially addictive pain medications, and what I'd call a textbook case of patient-centered care. Now, of course, this wasn't true just for me, but countless others who have had the privilege of working with spiritually competent doctors and nurses. And by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that asparagus is now, I'm not kidding you, it's now one of my favorite vegetables, which to me is a side effect, I suppose, of God's great and ironic sense of humor. So with that, do we still have a little time for questions? 23? Okay, so we have 4 minutes for questions. Make them fast. Any questions? Yeah.
So when you think there is a role for having this section, like when you, we have medical history.
Right.
Is there a role to have spiritual?
Yeah, I think as far as, they have obviously forms that you can fill out, you know, to take a parent's spiritual history. This is not my expertise, but I've heard and read about these. But I think before a doctor actually gets that form and says, make sure you ask these 10 questions about spiritual history, I think just even asking that basic question, anything that you'd like me to know about you? And that's often an opportunity for the patient to say, well, actually, yeah, I'm a devout Jew, or whatever, and I'm bummed out that I missed Sabbath today, or whatever. That can kind of open the door without making the doctor feel uncomfortable or the patient. But sometimes, too, just even ask the most basic question, are you engaged in any kind of, you know, just curious, you engaged in any kind of a religious practice? Sometimes it's the manner in which the question is asked, because you could have the doctor who's there literally with their back to him and saying, any spiritual history, belong to any church? And that's like, it's a little cold. But to actually engage face-to-face and say, anything, you know, of a spiritual nature you'd like me to know about, it can make a huge difference, even before you get the official form. Yeah, over here. That's a good question. If you didn't hear the question, have I ever felt uncomfortable sharing that information with somebody for fear that I might be labeled in that way? From my particular religious background as a Christian Scientist, that certainly comes up because I'm aware of what some of the misconceptions are about that. To be honest, though, that happened, it was 35 years ago or something. Personally, I haven't had any interactions since then. And again, it's not because I have this and I have it out for doctors. Obviously, I wouldn't be at this conference. It'd be a bad place to be. But I just haven't had that opportunity. But friends of mine who have had that opportunity, I think I haven't heard of any situation where it made them uncomfortable. Or if there are situations where the doctor is, you know, a little hesitation there, to me it's just an opportunity to just very quickly clarify, you know, don't worry, you know, we don't have it out for you, but I thought it was helpful for you to know this. Good question, though. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, there is being research done on the effects of these kinds of interactions. I think one of the foremost organizations is the Jewish group, George Washington Institute of Spirituality and Health on the East Coast. They're certainly researching this. But also I attended a chaplain conference a year or so ago in San Diego where the chaplains are becoming more professionalized, if you will, and that they're observing all kinds of really interesting stuff, but they're not accustomed to writing it down. You know, I get it with doctors, data is king. Give us the data. And so they're now encouraging the chaplains, at least write down what you're seeing, even if you don't have the language to express it in the way that we might understand or get, at least get this down. So we get kind of closing that gap between the spiritual folks and the medical folks, because they're all observing the same things, they just use different language to describe it. Thank you.